they sat me at the kids' table. Not because there weren't enough seats at the main table. There were. I counted them from across the room. 8 chairs, 6 people, 2 empty spots with folded napkins still pressed flat. My aunt had rented a hall for the occasion, one of those event spaces with drop ceilings, and a rented chandelier that hummed faintly when the air conditioning kicked on. Round tables with white polyester cloths. Centerpieces made from grocery store flowers. Carnations, mostly, dyed colors. Carnations don't actually grow in. My cousin's graduation party. My aunt had been planning it for 2 months. I drove 90 minutes to be there. They put me at a table near the back, next to my second cousins who were 8 and 11, and a folding chair that wobbled every time someone walked past. The 8-year-old was playing a game on his mother's phone with the volume on. The 11-year-old kept asking me if I wanted some of his bread roll. I said yes. Twice. It was the only thing that felt genuine at that table. My sister was at the main table. She had gotten there early. She always gets there early. And by the time I arrived, she had already arranged things exactly the way she wanted them. She sat next to our aunt, close enough that every time my aunt laughed, she touched my sister's arm. My sister wore a yellow dress with a wrap front and small gold earrings. She looked like someone who belonged. I was wearing black slacks and a silk blouse I had saved up for. Nobody commented on it. I told myself it was fine. It's a graduation party, not a seating chart competition. I told myself to let it go. I poured myself some water from the plastic pitcher on the kids' table and listened to the 8-year-old explain the rules of his game to nobody in particular. It was fine until the dessert. My aunt had ordered a custom cake. 3 tiers, pale yellow frosting, sugar flowers along the bottom edge. She walked around to each table herself, with slices on little dessert plates. The real kind? China, not the plastic ones the rest of us were using. She went to the main table first, then the table with her neighbors and her book club friends, then the table with my uncle's coworkers. She didn't come to the kids' table. My 8-year-old second cousin eventually wandered up and grabbed 2 slices and carried them back, one in each hand, and offered me one. I thanked him. He shrugged and sat back down with his phone. My sister noticed. She had been watching me from across the room the whole evening. I could feel it. That specific feeling of someone cataloging you. She came over while I was still holding the paper plate with my second-hand slice of cake. And she stood at the edge of the kids' table with her real china plate and her untouched sugar flower, and she said, loudly enough for the people at the nearest table to hear, "At least you got dessert. I wasn't sure they'd bring any over here." She smiled when she said it. That particular smile, I've known it my entire life. It's the one she uses when she wants you to understand something without having to say it directly. The smile that says, "I see you, exactly where you are, and I want you to know I see you." I looked at my plate. I looked at her plate. I didn't say anything. She went back to the main table and said something to my aunt that made them both laugh. I ate my cake. It was actually very good. Lemon, with a raspberry filling between the layers. The 11-year-old asked if I was going to finish the frosting, and I said yes. I drove home 90 minutes in the dark and did not cry until I got off the highway. I need to back up, because none of this makes sense without the context. And the context is the kind of thing that takes a while to explain, because it took me a long time to understand it myself. My parents divorced when I was 9. My sister was 14. We both stayed with our mother, which sounds like the same experience but wasn't, because my sister was old enough to understand what was happening in a way I wasn't, and because my mother grieved in a way that made her need my sister in a way she never needed me. They had something after the divorce, a closeness built out of shared crisis, and I was too young to be let in. Our father remarried. We saw him on alternating holidays and 2 weeks in the summer. My mother's side of the family, my aunt included, had always organized itself around my sister. She was the firstborn. She was the one who remembered things, who called on birthdays, who showed up early and stayed late. She was the one who arranged the seating at family functions, who my aunt called when she needed help with the invitations, who everyone assumed would give a speech at the graduation party even though it wasn't her graduation. She did give a speech. It was very good. She cried at the end. My aunt cried too. I clapped. I don't say any of this because I hate my sister. That's not the right word for what I feel about her. What I feel is more like, I've spent most of my life trying to find a language for it, and I still haven't quite landed on one. It's something like being in the same story as someone, but always reading a different version of it. She has one account of our childhood. I have another. Neither of us is lying, exactly, but they don't match up in the ways that matter. What I know is that she has always treated our family's attention as a resource she was managing, and she managed it carefully, and I was not one of her priorities. I had learned to live with that. What I hadn't learned to live with was what came after the graduation party. My aunt called me 3 weeks later. This surprised me. She doesn't call me often. Texting is easier, she says. And she prefers to text, which is fine, which is how most of our communication has worked for years. But she called, which meant she had something to say that required a phone call. She asked if I was doing well. I said yes. She asked about work. I told her work was good. I was finishing up a project that had taken most of the year, a commercial real estate development I'd been managing as the lead acquisition coordinator for a firm based out of Atlanta. I told her it was going well. She paused at real estate. Your sister mentioned you were doing something in property, she said. Acquisition and development, I said. I coordinate the due diligence on commercial purchases. We've closed 4 properties this year. Another pause. She said you were just helping out at an office somewhere. I held the phone and looked out my window. I live on the 4th floor of a building in a quiet part of the city, and from my window I can see a small park and, beyond it, the top floors of a parking structure. I looked at the parking structure. I've been doing this for 3 years, I said. Well. My aunt's voice had the particular texture it gets when she's processing something she doesn't want to process. I didn't realize. It's okay, I said, because it was what I always said. After we hung up, I sat on my couch for a long time. I thought about the cake. I thought about the seating chart. I thought about all the small ways the story of me that circulated in my family bore no resemblance to my actual life. The life I had built by myself in a city where nobody knew my last name, where I had made every mistake and recovered from every mistake and kept going. The version of me that my sister narrated to my aunt was the version of me that served her best. Younger, less capable, somewhere peripheral. I had let it go on for a long time. I decided to stop letting it go on. I want to be careful here, because I don't want to make this sound like a plan I had from the beginning. I didn't. What happened next wasn't a scheme or a revenge strategy. It was just, I stopped being quiet. I stopped letting other people fill in the blanks. I started by calling my aunt back. I called her 2 days later, and I told her, in the same even voice I use in client meetings, exactly what my job was. Not what it sounded like, not a summary. I told her the title, the company, the scope. I told her that in the past 18 months alone, I had personally managed the acquisition process on 7 commercial properties across 3 states, totaling a combined value of about $42 million. I heard her exhale. I had no idea, she said. I know, I said. I didn't realize how much wasn't being communicated. That was as much as I said about it. I didn't mention my sister. I didn't accuse anyone of anything. I just gave her the facts, the way I give facts in meetings, and let them land. My aunt said, you should come to dinner. I'll have the family. I said I'd be there. The dinner was at my aunt's house, which is a Victorian in a neighborhood she bought into 20 years ago before the prices changed. The dining room has a long mahogany table that seats 10, with real chairs, not folding ones. She sets it with the good dishes, the ones with the gold rim that she keeps in a cabinet in the hallway. I wore the same silk blouse. My sister was already there when I arrived. She was in the kitchen with my aunt, the way she always is, positioned, comfortable, already in the conversation. She turned when I came through the door and smiled at me and said it was good to see me, and I said it was good to see her too, and both of those things were technically true, in the way that technically true things sometimes are. We sat down to dinner. My aunt had made a roast and had bought a good bottle of wine, the kind she doesn't usually open. She poured it for everyone, and we talked about the usual things. My cousin starting her first job, my uncle's garden, whether or not someone should sell a property they'd been holding on to for years. My aunt turned to me when the property came up. You'd know about this, she said, with your work. My sister's face didn't change. That was the thing I noticed. She was practiced enough that her face didn't change, but her hands did. She set down her fork. "What are you working on now?" My aunt asked me, and I told them. Not a performance, not a monologue, just what I actually do in plain language, the way I would explain it to a client who is new to the process. I talked about how due diligence works, how we assess a property's value and history and liability before a purchase. I talked about the current project, a mixed-use development outside Savannah, 11 acres, the kind of deal that takes 2 years from first contact to close. I talked about what I had learned in 3 years of doing this work, about reading contracts and reading people, and understanding that the two skills are more similar than most people think. My uncle asked good questions. My aunt asked good questions. My cousin leaned forward. My sister was quiet. Afterward, when we were helping clear the dishes, she came up beside me at the sink and said, quietly, not unkindly, "I didn't know you were doing all of that." I looked at her. I thought about the graduation party. I thought about I wasn't sure they'd bring any over here, and the smile, and the way her china plate looked against my paper one. "I know," I said. "You never talk about it." "I never got much of a chance," I said, not meanly, just as a fact. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'm sorry for how I've talked about you to people." I didn't expect that. I think she didn't expect to say it. I turned off the faucet and dried my hands. "Thank you," I said. "That means a lot. It wasn't everything." One dinner, one apology, doesn't undo years of being seated at the back and spoken for by someone who edited you down to fit a story she preferred. But she said it, and she meant it, and I said, "Thank you," and I meant that too. Here's what happened after. I want to tell this part carefully, because it's the part that matters most to me, and it's the part that has nothing to do with my sister or my aunt, or the graduation party, or the cake. About a month after that dinner, I was in a meeting with the development team on the Savannah project. We had reached the community outreach phase, the part of mixed-use development that most people don't know exists, where you actually talk to the people who live near what you're planning to build. We had done town halls, surveys, listening sessions. One of the things that came up repeatedly was housing access. The area had a workforce housing shortage. Teachers, healthcare workers, service industry people who couldn't afford to live near where they worked. The development had room for a residential component. My firm was open to it. The question was the structure. I had been thinking about a land trust model for a few months. I brought it to the lead partner. He was skeptical at first. Land trusts limit certain kinds of return, and return is what the firm exists to generate. But I had done the math, and I had talked to 2 organizations that had done this successfully in similar markets, and I made the case the way I have learned to make cases. With evidence, not emotion. They agreed to a partial model. 30% of the residential units would be held in a community land trust, keeping them accessible at controlled prices for the long term. It wasn't everything the community advocates had asked for, but it was something real, with legal teeth, that would outlast any single administration or funding cycle. I filed the paperwork on a Tuesday. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with the executed documents in front of me, and I thought, this is the thing. Not the dinner, not the apology, not my sister finally knowing what I do. I had spent so long worrying about the table I was seated at that I had almost lost sight of the fact that I was building something. Not a story, something actual, with addresses and deed restrictions, and 30 families who would one day live in a place because of a series of decisions I made in a conference room in Atlanta. My 8-year-old cousin offered me his bread roll because that was the kind thing to do. I think about that sometimes, the kindness that comes without an audience, that doesn't need to know what you do for a living, or where you're seated, or whether you got the right plate. That's the kind I want to be. My aunt called me after the Savannah project closed. She had seen something about it in a newsletter the firm published, my name in the acknowledgments. "I told your sister," she said. "You don't have to do that," I said. "I wanted to." A pause. I should have been paying attention earlier. I told her it was okay. And here's the thing. It mostly is. Not because everything has been resolved or apologized for or made right. It hasn't, not entirely. but because I've learned the difference between the story that gets told about you and the life you're actually living, and I've decided which one I'm going to put my energy into. The story about me and my family was small. It was the version of me that was easy to manage, easy to seat at the back, easy to describe in a sentence to someone who didn't know me. The life I'm living doesn't fit in a sentence. I drive 90 minutes to family parties, and I carry my own history with me, and sometimes I get seated near the wobbling chair, and sometimes I get offered bread rolls by a kid who just wants to be kind, and all of that is part of it. But I'm not defined by where they put me. I am defined by what I built when I got home.